How did we arrive here, in this place where democracy has been stolen by big business, the media, and the government? Glenn Greenwald, the prize-winning journalist, explains to us why we feel so disinterested and detached from democratic process, because it doesn't mean anything, because it's a sham. I had this conversation with Glenn Greenwald on my podcast, Under the Skin, available from Luminary. In this clip, he goes deep about Trump, Obama, Biden, how various different figures pass through the White House and nothing changes for ordinary people. Also, we get onto the emergence of populism and what we might be able to do to truly change America, to truly change the world. If you enjoy this video, let me know in the comments below what you think. And if you've got any inquiries, you can hit me up with them there. Stay to the very end of the video. It's a good one.
It seems to me that, like, see that bit you touched on there, like they've saying, they're sort of saying people aren't sensitive enough or intelligent enough to deduce whether or not in the corruption league table Trump is worse than Biden, and we don't want to create this sort of idea that they're both comparable or both equally corrupt, or even that Biden is more corrupt. Therefore, let's withdraw that piece of information so that it can't even be viewed. So I suppose what that sort of shows us, and why it seems worse from the left, is because the left is purporting. So that, I suppose, shows the hollowness of the gestures, of the attitudes, of the sort of whole ideology, that this ideology is okay as long as it's never opposed. It's okay as long as you never have to suffer or sacrifice. It makes me angry. But I wonder, mate, also whether or not you feel that the distinction between Biden and Trump is not that significant, that power is quite immobile when it comes to it, and the sort of the ability to make meaningful decisions in those roles is quite limited. There's a few things I would just want to drop in so that I get to say in front of you. One was I watched only on the internet Bannon talking to the Oxford Union, and he'd spoken for 20 minutes before he said anything that I even remotely disagreed with. He didn't say anything about immigration or sex or gender or race. He just said, in 2008, this crash happened. These people went and saw Obama. Obama signed these documents. You ain't ever getting a mortgage, to the English audience, right? I saw that affected me. From talking to people around the Democratic Party, it became clear that the DNP would rather sacrifice a term to Trump than have Bernie stand, and that they maneuvered. So then what is that party about? What are their intentions? And therefore, who does represent ordinary working Americans? And therefore, they are right to vote for Donald Trump. They're right. That's the thing that I suppose viscerally affects me, for all the condemnation of, nationalistic, patriotic, white or whatever color working people in these Anglophonic nations. The fact is that they don't have an alternative. The alternative has been denied to them. These parties that were set up in order to represent their interests have become hollowed out and ultimately meaningless by the barometer that you earlier outlined, that if this, GCHQ and etc. can use these tropes, these images, these symbols, then they are not transformative.
One of the, I think, most interesting facts about the American polity that almost never gets discussed is the non-voter, the percentage of Americans who decide that voting is not worthwhile. So if you are a journalist or you're an activist and you say, look, I don't really think the differences between Republicans and Democrats are sufficiently compelling to make it even worthwhile to support one of them, I'm going to support a third party or I'm going to abstain. The instant accusation is that that's a viewpoint that comes from privilege. That because you're so privileged, you're wealthy, you're powerful, you're shielded from bigotry, you have the luxury to do that. But that people who are poor, people who are discriminated against, people who are marginalized don't have that privilege. The reality is the exact opposite. If you look at the profile of the non-voter, they're overwhelmingly and disproportionately poor and people of color. They're deciding, now, probably in some cases there are some obstacles that have been put in their way to vote, but it's not that hard to vote, even to register to vote and then to go vote. The lines are too long, they should be shorter, but people who want to go vote can vote. They're choosing not to vote. And there's a lot of polling data that polls non-voters and says, why don't you vote? They don't say, the lines are too long, or all these obstacles have been put. They say because I don't give a fuck. I don't think it matters. I don't care. It doesn't affect my life. Do you know they in 2016, after the shock of Trump's victory, one of the states Trump won that Hillary was expected to win was Wisconsin. So the New York Times actually published a really good article. They went to Milwaukee, which is a heavily African-American city that typically votes overwhelmingly Democrat. And they analyzed the reason Hillary lost Wisconsin was because so many Black voters who had voted in previous elections for Obama stayed at home. And they went and they asked them, knowing now that Trump won, in part because you decided to stay at home, do you regret that choice? And to a person, they all said, absolutely not. I don't regret it in the slightest. In fact, I only voted for Obama kind of out of like racial obligation. He didn't do shit for our lives. And I sure as hell wasn't going to go do that for Hillary. This is like the unspoken fact that just is disappeared because it's such a revealing fact about the two parties. If you only interview and speak to and hear from the people who believe that there are these really radical differences between the parties, that it's a battle between good and evil, if you only hear from them, it'll seem like that's true because you've just excluded everybody else, millions and millions of people, not a tiny fringe, millions and millions of people who think exactly the opposite. Ultimately, yeah, there are differences between the parties. I mean, you can't deny that there are differences. I mean, they have differences on cultural debates and the like, but on the questions of foreign policy, militarism, capitalism, the working class, there are really no differences at all. They're funded by exactly the same power centers. And, it's become this kind of stigmatized taboo view to talk about the existence of a deep state in the United States, even though there so obviously is one. If you just pick up any book of the Cold War, Devil's Chessboard or the Jakarta Method, there's several really good ones. That whole thing was created on purpose to be a secret power center that exercises dominion and hegemony regardless of the outcome of elections. You can have a Republican, you can have a Democrat, and the CIA gets what they want, the Pentagon gets what they want, the Wall Street gets what it wants, and now increasingly Silicon Valley gets what it wants. So what media outlets will do is focus on the small areas where there are differences, culture war differences, they'll exaggerate other differences to make it seem like you have this, like democracy is this incredibly messy, free for all, where there's all kinds of divergent views and there's tons of freedom everywhere in the discourse. And they achieve that by just eliminating and never talking about the incredibly consequential and ample policies where both parties agree, and by excluding from the discourse people who just say, I don't think there are any differences and therefore I don't participate.
Yeah, it's treated like a kind of apostasy. Like, that's where the real alliance is. It's like you will participate in this illusion. If you step outside it, like speaking to you and your great litany of death threats that you can slap on the table, I will report my own meager encounter with such matters. The only time, other than sort of trivial celebrity related stuff, that I've felt the sort of heat of the establishment, as it were, is when I sort of publicly a few years ago said, I don't think there's any point in voting. No one I know votes. It's stupid. It's pointless. I grew up just thinking it was pointless. When I said that, it was like they rained down on me. They rained down on me to stop saying that. Say something different. Say something else, because it does. And the implication of that I offer, Glenn, is that there must be this seeded, unexplored territory where a new political force, were it legitimate, could emerge, nationally, globally, however, if that was, focused upon, predicated upon the rights of ordinary people. Why is that not happening? Why has that not happened? Why did Syriza, Podemos, the sort of left-wing, somewhat democratic movements fail? And I sort of somewhat know that Syriza got sort of sucked into the system by the EU and Podemos became centralised and normalised. But why is it so hard, given that there's so much territory ceded, given that there's so much available space? Why is there not? Why are there not more voices that saying, "Hey, this is us. We're against big tech. We're against inequality. Well, this is our movement. This is our aims. These are the policies we'd implement." Why are these assassinatable figures not emerging?
I think we don't spend enough time thinking about the nature of power. So we talk about power a lot, right? Like people like to say it's important to speak truth to power. It's important to confront power centers, to talk about but we don't really talk about what power means. So I've spent time thinking about that because not just my experience when I did the NSA reporting and then worked with WikiLeaks, but also here in Brazil, where my life was, upended for a year and a half, where we didn't leave the house without an armored vehicle and armed guards because of our challenge to the Bolsonaro movement. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean when you say like you're going to go confront power? And to me, what it means, you can create different definitions, but at the core, what it means to say that someone is powerful is that they have the capability to reward anyone who serves their interests, to bestow on them benefits and advantages and gifts and assets, and conversely, to harm or punish or destroy anyone who impedes their interests. Ultimately, that's what power means. So if you go and you genuinely impede, I don't mean like symbolically or through pretend gesturing, but like actually impede people who wield power, they're going to use that power to try and destroy you. So look at what happened in your country, with Jeremy Corbyn, which I think, his ascension to the leadership of the Labor Party in a lot of ways was as cataclysmic as Trump's ascension to the White House. Someone like Jeremy Corbyn was never supposed to be the leader of the storied Labor Party with a chance to go be prime minister of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain. That was not supposed to happen. And just like you alluded to the fact that in the United States, people would rather have have lost to Trump than won with Sanders. Obviously, we know for sure now it's true. It was obvious all along, but now there are documents proving it, that the centrist, corporatist wing of the Labor Party obviously preferred to lose to Boris Johnson and win with Jeremy Corbyn. They did everything they could to sabotage the chances of the Labor Party. And they didn't just undermine him politically, they completely destroyed his character and reputation. I mean, it is assumed pretty much around the world, except in pockets of the left, that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite, one of the worst labels that you can put on anybody. When Bernie Sanders was challenging the actual status quo in 2016, he really wasn't doing it in 2020, but he was in 2016. They turned all of his followers overnight into this like racist, proto-fascist, misogynistic movement. Now, very similar to what they said about Corbyn supporters. They harass and abuse female reporters. They hate women. They're uniquely abusive. Same thing was done to the. So there's all kinds of tactics that power centers use, either first to co-opt you, right? So I'll just give you this quick example. This is always very clarifying for me. In Brazil, from 1964 to 1985, Brazil was ruled by a very savage, brutal, vicious military dictatorship, of which Jair Bolsonaro was a part. He was a young army captain in it. And they did all the things dictatorships do. They killed dissidents, they imprisoned journalists, they exiled artists, all of that. They revoked every civic right and civic liberty possible. But before that, Brazil was a burgeoning democracy. It was steadfastly neutral between Moscow and Washington in the Cold War. It didn't want to get drawn in. And it was growing as a democracy. It was like a model for the region. And they elected a center-left government in 1963 that really was center-left, not left. They weren't communists, they weren't socialists. They were doing moderate reforms to the economy just to kind of assuage some income inequality, like rent control and like nationalizing a few industries that had previously belonged to the public, but nothing revolutionary. But that was way too much for Washington. So under the Kennedy administration and then the Johnson administration, they kept going and visiting Brazil and telling that president, you need to stop this. You need to do market reforms that allow international capital to buy these assets. You're going way too far. So they first tried to co-opt him, saying, we'll let you stay in power as long as you move over and we get comfortable with you. You give up this kind of extremist ideology. You can keep the leftist rhetoric. but like open up the markets and keep everything, you know, the way it was. Stop putting limits on what landowners can charge for rent. Stop nationalizing industry so that your resources go to serve the Brazilian people instead of letting our corporations buy it and exploit it for the benefit of us. And when he said no over and over and over, in 1964, they engineered a coup and they overthrew that government, installed the military regime that destroyed Brazil for the next 21 years. That's what power does. That's what power does. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when there are movements that arise that are genuinely threatening to the neoliberal order, they're going to do everything possible to obliterate them. And they use propaganda, they use media outlets, and they use every conceivable dirty trick to do it. And I think that I do think the left has challenges we talked about before about how to communicate its program and try and reconcile this kind of, you know, cultural agenda with economic ones. So I don't want to absolve the left completely, but I also think that there are real power centers and they know how to use power.
Did you enjoy that video? If you did, please let me know in the comments. Do you agree with Glenn Greenwald? Do you agree with what I'm saying? Where do you get your optimism, your hope, and your faith from? Give us a thumbs up, subscribe, turn on the notification bell. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. If you need to meditate now or develop some spirituality, have a look at this one. Sign up to my mailing list, please. And if you're in the UK between January and May, come and see me live. Please stay free.